Can you take your seats, please? We're about to start. Thanks. Okay, good morning. Welcome to this event. Again, Silicon Valley. I'm Fabio Chiusi. I'm a freelance journalist. And my guest here is Evgeny Morozov. He is author of a couple of, I think, fundamental books to understand the so-called digital, which is going to be problematized today. One book is to Save Everything, Click Here from 2013. The other one is The Net Delusion, 2011. And then we have this one. This is just for the Italian public, actually. It's a collection of essays. It's called Silicon Valley, Signori del Silicio. And we're going to discuss a bit, starting from this book. So I'll go straight to the questions, and I'll go straight to the point. In the book, again, he writes that the thesis is quite simple, and to debate technology today is to endorse, often unwittingly, some of the vilest aspects of the neoliberal ideology. And worse, it doesn't matter what side you're on, for most critiques of Silicon Valley are also happen to be aligned with neoliberalism. So my first question is, what are these aspects of neoliberal ideology that comes into play when talking about Silicon Valley, and what kind of ideology, what you mean also by ideology here?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think we can leave aside the easiest question and about technology in general, and I think we have, broad agreement in this room that technology can be of great assistance to all sorts of emancipatory projects, political, social, and so forth, communal ones. There is nothing inherently anti-solidarity or anti-human in technology as such. The problem is that today, if you do want to put technology to a good use, for political emancipatory change of any kind, if you're a social movement, if you are a radical new party, if you're a new radical government that would like to challenge any part of the current neoliberal agenda, you're forced to work with the technologies that we have. The technologies that we have right now happen to be run and owned by just a couple of 4 or 5 firms, most of them American ones, who increasingly take over functions that used to be performed by other social, public, non-commercial institutions. So there are 2 elements here. First is the way in which the entrance of those firms into areas of society and domains of society beyond just advertising, which is used to be primarily how they made money. If you look at Google and Facebook, it used to be that the majority of what they did was relatively innocuous. I mean, journalists suffered because clearly a lot of money was taken from them because they could no longer make money from advertising, but it was more or less limited to the media. With the proliferation of the Internet of Things, and the ability to collect huge amounts of data, it became possible to put the same logic of optimization into other domains, from education to health to transportation to whatever you want to name. There is probably a digital platform and a digital intermediary that has stepped in and offered itself as the natural way to organize how that particular industry or social domain is run. Whether it's Uber when it comes to how we use taxis and private transport, whether it's Airbnb when it comes to housing, whether it's any of the number of startups that currently exist in Silicon Valley, there is probably a company that would like to change and transform how every single industry or sector is run and administered. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that clearly there is a transfer of power to the private sector, which is, a landmark characteristic of neoliberalism, that you suddenly have a new type of capitalism emerging that presents itself as ultimately being far more efficient, far more effective than the previous kinds, and also far less corrupt. If you look at some of the rhetoric that Uber, for example, makes vis-a-vis the taxi industry, which is not incorrect. And at the same time, they pitch themselves as more or less not just inevitable, but also undisruptible partner of the public, because it is literally impossible to present and come up with any alternative to them as infrastructure, because they're the ones who run the sectors, who own the data, who own the machine learning and data analytics platforms for making sense of that data, which basically means that any project that would like to offer an alternative vision for social emancipation that does not default to just private property, commodification of everything, privatization of everything, is forced to work in that new environment where more or less that infrastructure for organization and that infrastructure even for the administration of everyday life is already in the hands of firms whose primarily interest is profit, even though you do not necessarily see it, because much of what they offer is offered technically at zero cost or subsidized cost, right? So there is a natural tendency in that sector to be seen as allies of the public, because they make services that previously you had to pay for cheaper, or they make them free completely. And I think that ideology actually started with Google, where you had a company enter a domain that previously, which is a domain of information and communication services, right, which is about how we find information and how we communicate with each other. If you look at what kind of institutions provided that service before Google's entrance, you would clearly identify at least two of them. One would be the post office, and one would be the library. And both the post office and the library worked in a very different logic. One of them was funded through taxes, and another one was heavily funded through taxes, but was also heavily funded through stamps and other sorts of ways for paying for the delivery of the actual service. Right? From the perspective of the user, if you're just thinking only in terms of cost and price, which to me is the hallmark of neoliberal ideology, it's the reduction of virtually any decision making to the price signal as the only determinant of value, then if you're only thinking in terms of price and cost, of course, this new ecosystem that emerges from Silicon Valley and Google is vastly superior, because A, it comes for free, B, it technically, even though that's not correct in reality, does not really require much by way of taxes, and C, it's much more efficient and much more superior. Of course, in the process, you lose a lot of other things. You lose the anonymity that you had in using libraries and post offices. You could probably, 200 years ago, easily imagine a system where, your post office would say, well, instead of charging you for stamps, we're going to open up every single letter that you send, scan the text inside it, and insert an ad into your envelope, and that way we're going to pay for the service. I mean, this is essentially what Google is doing, right? So the transformation of that logic from a logic where we are prepared to subsidize certain things, and libraries more or less function on the same model. The transformation of that model from a time where you could actually subsidize certain parts of the service provision with taxes or fees, that more or less is gone, and we have entered an era where you have this vicious circle where you can actually offer more and more services that are digitized and underwrite them and subsidize them that way through the private sector, with the private sector more or less exploiting the data that they generate in the context of using and providing those services to subsidize the costs. Which basically means that if you think about it, there is virtually no sector that cannot be privatized by covertly delegating the responsibility to run it to Silicon Valley. And many of them come with heavy pockets from venture capital investors and from companies like Goldman Sachs. So, you look at a company like Uber. Uber has a capitalization of more than $60 billion. And of course, they can afford to burn as much money as they want, billions every year, in order to offer rides at costs that are even below what it costs them to offer the ride in order to gain the market share. So from the perspective of the user, I mean, yes, there is superior experience and whatnot, but there is also clearly a cost factor, and it looks that it's much cheaper. That, of course, is subsidized by global financial capital of the likes of Goldman Sachs, with the hope of destroying local competition entirely and then exploiting the new efficiencies of scale to actually derive even more profit. In that sense, Uber is not very different from Walmart. It's just that it looks much nicer. So, I mean, I've said quite a bit. Maybe we can sort of move to the next question. But I think the main thing to keep in mind here is that at the state level, both in Europe and North America, there is a urge and tendency to make both public and non-public services more efficient, mostly by privatizing them. And that agenda has found a very effective and willing ally in technology firms, who basically can undertake that agenda in a way that's much less confrontational, with an exception of labor issues, which is where Uber comes in. On most other issues, and tourism and Airbnb, you can actually look at it and you'll find some contention, but it's not as contentious as privatizing the water company. And at the same time, they promise efficiency and they allow political leaders to claim that they are greatest innovators in the world and claim that it's all about the future and so forth. And I think we have to understand that clearly there is more here when we think critically about those issues, the technophobia. There is nothing here that is technophobic. What is missing in most of our discussions about these technologies is precisely the situation of them in the current political, and economic, and historical context, where the state can no longer deliver, the private sector wants to deliver, and you have an ongoing digitization which allows this transfer in a way that wasn't possible before, because you have these new kinds of intermediaries that can suddenly jump from one sector to another, build models that can scale. So you build a smart city solution for the city of, I don't know, Milan or Barcelona, and then you take it to India and install it in 200 other cities. I mean, this stuff scales really well, much better than anything physical. And I think there is no other way but to start talking about a new kind of predatory capitalism that is heavily reliant on data, that treats data as a private property thing and not something that can be owned by the public. And it's being enacted through commercial pressure from those firms, the money they raise from Wall Street and financial capital, and with very nice nudging from the American government through agreements and treaties like TTIP and TPP and TISA, which include all sorts of provisions on the promotion of free circulation of data, free circulation of information, and all sorts of other tight and kind of polite nudging to cities to start embracing things like the smart city programs. And that's it. So it's a very complex architecture of political, economic, commercial, and historical measures that I think is the only way for us to understand both what's happening now with Silicon Valley and also why we are at an edge of a very new regime that I don't think will actually be nicer and kind of rosier and as utopian, and certainly not as utopian as even its sort of realistic advocates claim it would be.
Yeah. So what concerns me, of course, is also the impact on politics that all of this is having. And the state is disappearing, you say, and also in a recent op-ed for The Guardian, you said that the Western democratic capitalism is under a legitimacy threat. And so my idea is that, knowing all of this, it sounds like every time we access Facebook, every time we make a search on Google, every time we take a ride on Uber, we're actually endorsing a political program, which is not that explicit, And this is also in the book. You write, for example, that the global fight to watch is between two high-tech populisms as a result. And those on the left, and I think represented by political parties like Podemos or the five-star movements that make a huge, they rely hugely on communication and technology to foster to promote their consensus. And those on the right, that is represented by Silicon Valley and all that you just said. So is this also shallowing our politics? Is this also forcing us to be nudged and fooled also by the experiments in Silicon Valley?
Sure. So, there are a couple of issues here. First of all, I have no problem with left-wing populism. I think we need more of it. So let's just get that out of the way.
Okay.
With regards to what's happening with these firms, you have to understand that they have embraced this nice language of platforms, right? They're all platforms, and they're all run by algorithms. And it's as if, they are the most objective thing on earth, and they're just there to to render reality as it is, which of course is nonsense. They are ultimately a bunch of business firms who are there to make money, and the algorithms there serve a particular purpose, which is to make you click more links so that the company behind the algorithm can find out more about you and thus develop a better and more detailed advertising profile than they can sell to advertisers. So the entire design of those platforms and algorithms is built more or less with one goal in mind, and that goal is to make you as distracted as possible by clicking as many links as you can in 1 hour. I mean, that's why you feel so distracted. I mean, don't blame your iPhone. It has to do with something else. That said, I think if you start unpacking the false neutrality of those platforms, you also realize that these firms are not just platforms that have certain business interests, and they definitely have a certain lobbying agenda in terms of lobbying those in power to enact certain laws. They're also media companies who suddenly can mobilize their users to do things which are in the interest of those firms, because they claim that what is in our interest is also in your interest as users.
That's in India with Facebook.
So to give a couple of examples, I mean, it all actually started a few years ago, and most of us in this field, I think, missed the implications of this when this firm started the protest against this horrible law that was about to be passed in America, SOPA, right? And what all of those firms did back then was to basically use their front pages as platforms to advocate against this bill. Wikipedia blacked out their page for a long time. Google did something similar. All of the firms took a very active stance by using their visual real estate, so to say, as a way of advocating for a particular political cause. And even though many of us agreed with that cause, I think it should have triggered a more thorough soul searching as to whether it's actually a good idea to have those firms use their own platforms to advocate laws that are for or against them. So, and since then, they've taken it to extremes. So, Facebook has been having a bit of a conflict in India where they were trying to launch their so-called Free Basics project to deliver so-called free internet to the poor. You see how this populism works even in rhetoric. And as a lot of Indian activists started raising concerns about it, Facebook basically started sending text messages to its users, mobilizing them to actually support its efforts and oppose the law. And Uber did something very similar last year when the mayor of New York was trying to block it, or at least to regulate it. They basically put a button on their app so that people could actually, make fun and complain to the mayor, de Blasio. So that in itself to me suggests that we have to understand, what's happening legally and politically, this clearly what I'm saying here about the platforms, but also ideologically at the level of the user, because there is a certain affinity between the interests of citizens who have been completely reduced to consumers and stripped of any political dimension, and what these firms want to do. I don't want to blame, I'm not the kind of moralistic guy who wants to be blaming people for clicking things on Facebook or putting their apartment on Airbnb. Right now, a lot of those things, they're compelled by the social economic factors which are normal. And this is where the contribution of Silicon Valley to the maintenance of current democratic capitalism, if you can still call it that way, even though I doubt it's any more democratic, is extremely, it's very easy to see here, because ultimately the pitch that both Airbnb, Uber, and others make is that it's thanks to them that the people who have been hit by the financial crisis and can no longer make their ends meet can actually get a job in Uber, driving a car as an extra source of income, or they can put their spare room on Airbnb and make some extra cash to supplement their stagnating income or non-existing income in many countries. And all of those firms make the pitch like that the government step in basically to tie their hands, and while they're tying their hands, they are also preventing citizens from actually finding their own solutions to the crisis. Right? And there is just so much insincerity and so many lies in the rhetoric promoted by those companies that if you actually start analyzing it closely, you can't, because Airbnb doesn't want to give you data about who actually rents those apartments in New York, Amsterdam, or somewhere else. So you have to have people independently trying to piece together this data to understand who are these people. Are they actual people who are struggling to get by, who cannot make their ends meet? Or are those giant real estate investors who have bought 200 apartments in each district and have turned them into Airbnb hotspots, so they're actually using them to make a lot of cash? And the independent data that is gathered by people looking at Airbnb closely suggests that it has nothing to do, it has very little to do with the well-being of people hit by the crisis. It has everything to do with the interest of very large investors who do operate large parts of the real estate market in big cities in the world, Amsterdam, New York, and so forth. And that's the reality, that, you know, the rhetoric of populism is there. The reality is very different, and this is where you really have to understand the alliances between globalized financial capital that stands behind Uber as an investor and that uses the likes of Airbnb to become even more profitable, and Silicon Valley. I mean, this is what I've been saying. It's impossible to understand where Silicon Valley fits into today's contemporary capitalism without developing a better understanding of the links between where that capital actually comes from. How come any stupid startup that wants to build a social network for people who would like to clean some dog shit from the street can go and raise $5 million in Silicon Valley overnight? I mean, where does this money come from? I mean, we're hit by a financial crisis. And yet you can imagine an idea that will be as ridiculous as ever and raise money for that idea tomorrow. Where does all this money come from? Where is this capital coming from? I mean, and I think the debate that we have failed to have was to accept Silicon Valley's own terms of reference and discussion, which is to say that these guys have a history. That history starts in the 70s with a bunch of them taking LSD and inventing interesting things in a garage. It exists completely outside of the history of capitalism, or history of militarism, or history of imperialism. And they're just there floating on their own, innovating, wearing flip-flops, wearing hoodies, and so forth. And that they have no connection whatsoever to the interests of the American state, have no connection whatsoever to the interests of Wall Street. And they're just there wanting to save the world, organize a hackathon, you know, engage in some humanitarian mission in Africa, and so forth. I think that this is nonsense. That we have to understand them as what they are, which are basically accessoires, and increasingly very important accessoires to power, whether the power is military or economic.
So one of the problems, of course, is that the ideological level. Ideology is about crushing imagination too, right? So crushing the imagining of alternatives. But still, can we actually build an alternative somehow to this kind of world? And I know that you just said, you know, that you're okay with left populism. Is it part of the way to go? Is it part of the political way to try and imagine a different ecosystem?
Well, first of all, my definition of ideology is probably a bit different from yours. I don't think you can exist outside of ideology. In that sense, I don't think that, you know, there is a pre-ideological situation where we all think rationally and then somehow ideology steps in to confuse us. No, I think all of us work within an ideology of sorts from the very beginning. And it can favor certain distributions of power, certain distributions of responsibilities, but that ideology exists nonetheless. With regards to sort of what's to be done question, I think if you take what I've said at face value, if you actually follow the steps of trying to resituate these giants in a much broader social and economic milieu, so to say, I think you'll quickly realize that ultimately our ability to fight them is proportional to our ability to fight some of the most vile developments in contemporary neoliberal capitalism as such, which is privatization of virtually everything, eradication of non-market logics from how we value things, and more or less commodification of everyday life to its ultimate extreme, where virtually everything will be mediated by the market. I mean, this is the reality, right? And that reality, as I've said, is enacted not just discursively. It's not just a bunch of people walking around saying things like, you know, the market is everything and we need to disrupt and innovate and so forth. It's also spread around legally, technologically, economically, and so forth. This is how global power operates. There is an architecture behind it, there is a foundation behind it, and there is a network, a complex of actors. Those actors can be embedded in governments, they can be embedded in foundations, they can be embedded in media and so forth. And this is what global neoliberal capitalism is today. Silicon Valley makes part of it, and I think it accounts for its future, both technologically but also ideationally. If you were to think about any good story about contemporary capitalism today, virtually all the stories are horrible. People are losing jobs. There is youth unemployment all over in Europe. You have terrorism plus a flood of refugees. You have the financial crisis, which hasn't been resolved yet. Trust in political parties is declining. Housing markets are, prices are skyrocketing. People can no longer afford a house. Even in prosperous countries, you go to the UK, you know, hunger and homelessness is on the rise. You know, you have food kitchens in half of Europe. I mean, there is no good story whatsoever in the world right now, in the West at least, except for some ultimate salvation by digital saviors who will come in and make everything efficient, make everything slick, make transportation available for free, and even offer basic income, which is as much of a ridiculous plan from Silicon Valley as I've heard, because their vision of basic income is that, well, you know, we're not going to pay any taxes, because why pay taxes? We do things that are digital. But we would nonetheless would like somebody to pay our drivers to have basic income so that we also don't have to pay them. I mean, that's the basic argument for basic income from Silicon Valley. Right? I mean, it's very ridiculous, but nonetheless, they are ideationally the source of hope. And if you point out that, you know, that source of hope is kind of fake, then I think you might actually get some people to think critically. But speaking a little bit more pragmatically, I think, look, you have to understand what is at the heart of their expansion and their domination. And there are several things. Data is definitely key. So if you can find ways to prevent them from claiming the data that passes through their networks, that is produced by the users, as their own, then you will at least slow down the machinery. If you manage to articulate a regime, a political economic regime, that will allow you to put that data to an alternative use, so that you can actually start building new experiments with that data. I'm all for local communities of citizens aggregating their own data and running their own electricity smart grids, running their own transportation networks, running their own services. It's doable, it's feasible, and it must be done. The problem is that once you are alienated from that data, and right now this alienation happens from the very beginning because it happens at source, because you are alienated from it by default, it just leaves your devices. That option is foreclosed, which is, you know, another argument to show that the capture of other forms of social cooperation that do not default to the market mechanism is also happening at the level of technological infrastructure and data and algorithms and so forth, and sensors and so forth. Even if we have the data, though, we would still miss the infrastructural capacity to make sense of it. And this is where you have to, again, to understand the picture holistically and figure out how things like machine learning, data analytics, predictive analytics, commented on how the scale at which these companies operate right now makes them more or less the only players that are capable of doing anything useful with that data. At large scale, at small scale, you can still do things, right? And this is where I think we need to articulate a strategy to hit them where it hurts. And I don't think you can do it at the level of the nation state, even though it's obvious that it must be done at the level of the nation state, or even at the higher level, because the nation states themselves right now, for the most part, are vehicles of the same neoliberal capitalist ideology that the program I've just articulated seeks to undermine. You can do it at a somewhat smaller level by capturing the cities. And, you know, so far we have seen that happen in some places in Europe. We have seen that happen in Spain with Barcelona and Madrid and Zaragoza. We have seen a lot of efforts, also you would know it very well in Italy, at a local level to a little bit reverse the logic of privatization, you know, whether it was the referendum on the right to water in this country, or whether it was efforts to remunicipalize electricity grids, energy networks in Germany, in Hamburg and Berlin. There are efforts in Europe to do that, but they're happening at the level of the city, which I think is not bad, because the city is also the level which is most problematic in this hierarchy of neoliberal consensus. Because cities are places where protests break down, everywhere, including in America. If you look at all of the protests that have happened in America recently, Ferguson, Baltimore, and so forth, they all break out in the cities. But cities are also places where you still have some contestation of the basic principles because people are hit by neoliberalism in the face in the city. Because this is where you have to pay for gas, for water, you have to pay for transport, you have to struggle with housing issues and so forth. So this is where the weakest point of neoliberalism resides. So I think the only paradigm that possibly can make sense right now is A, to develop a city-level strategy for articulating an alternative regime for data ownership, for operating alternative networks for data capture with sensors and so forth, and B, it's for the cities to start working together to scale up some of that infrastructure on the global level. And we already have some efforts that have existed for a while, like the network of rebel cities and the right to the city sort of convention. There are efforts that are trying to do that, but I think it should be done because ultimately no city is big enough to be able to come up with the infrastructure that can actually compete with that offered by those firms. Otherwise, in the next 4 or 5 years, you will see complete surrender of cities in Europe and America to the likes of Cisco, HP, Microsoft, and increasingly Google and others, which are coming in and pitching themselves in as ultimate saviors of the public, because they are the only ones who are capable of making our infrastructure more efficient at the times of that drastic budget cuts. You don't have the budget to run your own electricity networks. You have lead in your water, as they now discovered they actually have in many American towns. Well, invite Cisco in. We'll analyze your water and make the system bearable. Like, that's the slogan for Silicon Valley. We'll make the current suffering bearable. That's, I think, the actual pitch, which, of course, they don't put as dramatically. They give it a much more positive spin. But that's what it is. It's a tool to survive under conditions of neoliberal austerity that are no longer tolerable and would not otherwise be tolerated if not for the false ideology packed by Silicon Valley and some marginal advances on making efficient use of scarce resources that are enabled by their technologies.
Yeah, in the book you also make an interesting comparison between the energy consumption and information consumption. So you talk about energetic consumerism and information consumerism. Is there a chance that the system will collapse by itself if we let it go? Like, you talk also about an information disaster waiting to happen somehow. Is it possible that the system will collapse under its own weight?
Well, I mean, look, there are two kinds of collapses here. I mean, you can talk about systemic collapse that is not necessarily related to technology in Silicon Valley. I think that I would not necessarily be betting on the long-term future of capitalism now if I had to bet, for the sole reason that, and here I'm sort of advancing the argument made by a very interesting German sociologist, Wolfgang Strick, who's basically has been arguing, himself building on Polanyi, that in order to survive, capitalism always needed good and strong enemies. You always needed some counter-movement to come and take certain things from the logic of the market, because otherwise capitalism is just self-destructive. This is why you had to have the welfare state step in and decommodify things like education and healthcare so that you could actually have a workforce that would not be precarious and that would actually be able to go to the factory 9 to 5 and deliver its service. So from that sense, the critiques of the welfare state from the left, many of them here in Italy in the autonomous tradition, have of course been completely right. That ultimately the welfare state was an institution that was necessary for the Western democratic capitalism to function. What is happening now with the disruption of the welfare state, which is happening for reasons that have to do with neoliberalism, have to do with the debt crisis, which we can go into, it's a much more complicated issue, and the increasing entrance of these new firms from Silicon Valley into this domain, you basically have the foundation that was built for capitalism being undermined without anything new coming into existence other than perhaps some vague talk of basic income, which would be fantastic if enacted on properly radical leftist principles, and which would be a disaster if Silicon Valley goes ahead with its own plan. So in that sense, there is the possibility that the system will collapse, in part because its countervailing force that made it aware of its own limitations is no longer there and is getting weaker. technologically speaking, what I meant, I think, by that reference to information versus environment in the book is that, with environmental collapse, with an environmental crisis, the consequences are much more obvious because they are much more evident. Even though, we can argue and debate about whether the temperature is rising by 1% or 2% or degree, you can still sense pollution in the air. With information, the situation is trickier, and this is why so many of us completely uncritically accept the efficiency gains offered by those services, and many of us unwillingly accept it. And I think there is a certain kind of almost postmodern anxiety about institutions which people believe are already corrupt, that makes Silicon Valley look so much better. Because you know that, hey, your taxi company is clearly full of crooks, so why not have Uber, which will come in, and at least there the crooks are Goldman Sachs, and like, what do you know about them? But I think we also have to keep in mind something, and I think that will illustrate very nicely this kind of lack of structural dimension of what I'm saying. You look now at firms in the so-called fintech industry, financial technology. Yeah, so it's a growing, brewing market in Silicon Valley. And all they basically say is that, you know what, a lot of people have been excluded from borrowing. They cannot borrow because they don't have a credit history. They don't have a house where they live. They don't pay rent. They don't have regular payments. But we know that they are creditworthy because there are certain data points in their life that suggest so. They pay their mobile bill every month. And then they develop 80,000 of those points. So apparently if you charge your phone every night at 9 o'clock, that makes you more creditworthy if you charge it in the morning, right? So they come up with 80,000 data points, and then they study all of them. And then there are features that basically, look, now we can cater to the unbankable population. And how do you make sense of such a development? You can say, fantastic, now suddenly 50,000 people, 50 million people can suddenly become bankable who've previously been excluded from the debt system. Great. Another way to read the situation, of course, to say, well, look, what is this? That's just another way to make more people indebted. And the structural problem here is that. It's not the fact that you have more data to generate that. The structural problem here is debt itself. Why on earth do I need so much debt now, as opposed to 30 years ago, to do everything, like you need that in America, it's even worse than here, but you need that to study, you need that to buy a car, you need that to buy a house, you need that to get by, you need to have 5 different credit cards. It's great that now I can become more bankable, and you can even introduce more people into this trap. And clearly there, of course, the bad, evil guy in the room who's being disrupted are the payday loans companies and the loan sharks who would offer the same kind of loans at those people at disproportionate rates. So of course you would think this is a good thing. Now with Silicon Valley you'll pay lower rates that you're paying to loan sharks, but that in itself is beyond the point. The point here is debt. And I think that our structural inability to talk about this powerful economic and political issues, and instead engage in some kind of silly debate about technology disrupting everything and whether we are technophobes or whether we are digital innovators or champions, a word I hate, it's just ridiculous.
I would open up questions from the audience, if you want. We have 15 minutes or so.
Well, I'm a bit nervous because it's the first time I meet you, Evgeny, so it's really, I'm nervous.
Don't bite, don't worry.
Okay, so I will have many questions, but I will try to be concise and just make one. Correct me if I'm wrong. From what I understand, from what you say, you basically are blaming the mere fact that the world is going in a direction you don't agree with. It doesn't have much to do with data in the very sense of it. It has to do with the political stance that the world is taking. People are giving up their rights voluntarily. That's the main issue, I think. You are not focusing on. People are creating this world. It's not multinationals, it's not governments. People elect parliaments. People pay these multinationals. People are willing to do these things. So how do you correct this? How you make people change their own minds? How you make people choose the options that are not the ones that they choose now? I make just 2 examples. There is an alternative to Facebook, which is called Diaspora, but just nobody's using it. It gives you the right to your own data. You don't give up your rights at all, but nobody uses it. How do you push people to use things like Diaspora without, how do you think the governments could push people use Diaspora? Because you said that it has to be something that the state has to do. The state has to put infrastructures, the state has to direct how people have to live their own lives. In a sense, I might agree, but people elect this kind of governments.
Okay.
So, okay.
Good. Should I respond or should I make more? Okay, so I'll try to be concise also in my answer. First of all, I don't think it's even correct to say that people elect governments anymore, because most people don't vote. If you look at Western Europe, right? They just don't. They don't give a damn for the sole reason that there has been a complete collapse of trust in political parties and institutions. If you look at the surveys and polls, political parties are the institutions that are trusted the least of any other institution that exists in Europe. So you have a much broader crisis of representation with people despairing on politics for reasons that I think are not necessarily wrong. That there is a very profound crisis of representation, and at this point, political parties, with a few upstart exceptions, have become more or less clients to interests that they represent in parliament. They no longer represent citizens themselves. I can't draw any other analysis from the apathy that people show towards political life differently. Now, the question of ethics here and what platforms should be using and what people should be doing. Again, I'm not, every time people talk about morality and ethics in this domain, I get very uneasy for the sole part that this is how governmentality, to use a fancy word, works. Like, you're being told to do things because they're supposedly ethical. And where does that ethic come from? Like, if you are being structurally constrained to be present on Facebook because this is how you aggregate and build your reputation today, like, you need to have at least 100 Facebook friends in order to be able to prove to Airbnb that you are a reliable host or guest. If you have less than 100 Facebook friends, then your life becomes much more complicated. You have to use your passport and so forth. You can't do it with Diaspora, and you can't do it for various reasons that have to do with network effects, that have to do with the amount of capital that is being poured into those firms, that has to do with the amount of money that is not being poured into alternatives. Why does European Union have billions of dollars to spend on innovation, and why is none of that money going to creating alternatives to Facebook? Why? Because all of that is going mostly to corrupt telecoms who have put enough lobbyists in Brussels in order to claim that money. Why is that happening? Because the process of political representation in Europe is broken. Which means that structurally, those alternatives are not there. And I would never be urging anybody to be going on using Diaspora. Like, you can, as an ethical stance, if you want to prove that you are engaging in some kind of ethical consumption, I don't believe in ethical consumption as a potent alternative to changing power structures. To change power structures, you need to pursue a different kind of tactic. And in this case, I think that we have to understand that the reason why people are pushed to use those services, it's not just they, wake up and they're completely free agents and they realize that, hey, wouldn't it be better? What other choices are there that would be as fast and that would help them save time? I mean, at this point, Google pitches itself very clearly to people. They say, you start using our services and we'll generate time out of free air for you. Because we'll use services like virtual assistants, like Google Now, which will basically monitor everything you do on all of our services and run live for you. Everybody will get a personal assistant. Like, go use another service, and if you use another service outside of Google's ecosystem, it means you're effectively paying a tax. You are willing not to have a company come in and organize your everyday life for you. If you're a rich person, you can do that. If you're a Richard Stallman, you can do it. Most people can't and won't because they find themselves under immense pressure from 2 or 3 jobs they have to run if they are lucky to have them, or they have other concerns like being able to prove to their bank that they're actually reliable, for which you will need data very soon. you'll have the logic of the credit score more or less spreading to other domains and incorporating more and more data. So the only answer I can give you to this question is that it's only answerable if you take account of both the structural and political crisis of the state we're in, and if you understand that there are structural reasons why those services and platforms are used more often than others.
There are many questions. Okay.
Question for Mr. Morozov. Good morning. I'm an Italian journalist, and I read you and hear you and find what you write and say is well said and written. But the point I'm kind of missing is you said how to react to this, react at a citizen point of view. But what about the state level? I'm paying mostly my taxes to state, not to city. I would like my state, my nation, Italy, to react to warn me from all these, no? So that what, from your point of view, can state do? Have you ever heard about the Quant project, for instance, to make a search engine in Europe, which is driven not tracking people, not transferring data to the US citizens, companies, and agencies, at basing all this from a nation, no, Italian, French, and German point of view? And what else can we do apart from trying to make these companies, these big multinational, pay taxes when they operate in our countries? Thanks.
Okay. So, look, the only answer I can give you is that if you condense what I've said about the politics and the sort of economic and social background in Europe, Silicon Valley and its solution represents the status quo between center-left and center-right in Europe. This is the status quo of how the world will function given the collapse of everything else. Given this background, you cannot possibly count on the state if the state will continue to be governed by center-left or center-right or a coalition thereof, whether that coalition is explicit or implicit. You cannot just hope to do that because they are deeply in bed with those people, including by appointing them to many advisory positions. So you should be blind to be expecting these people to formulate an answer to the question that they themselves have created. You can expect those answers to come from somewhere else. And we do have a lot of upsurging movements in Europe that would like to challenge the status quo, and it just happens that many of them happen to be very right-wing. There are some that happen to be more leaning to the left and would like to challenge the status quo from the left. Personally, I'm with those. That said, I think you have to understand the reason why I am also stressing the local level as opposed to the national one is that it's not going to be possible to create a European alternative to Google by using some kind of central planning model that will just look at Google and structurally try to replicate everything that Google does. You will need to do it in a much more modular, decentralized manner, whereby you will actually be collecting data from users, municipalities, and localities locally, and you will be offering services to people also partly on a local level, but the data will need to be collected locally, and then apps and all sorts of extra services for finding information will need to be built on top of that. The only way to do that is actually having a clever strategy that will pull all of that data coming from the bottom up together. You will not be able to do it otherwise. So once you have that in place, and you do happen to have a political movement that actually is interested in disrupting the status quo, you can talk about the national level, and then maybe you can talk about the European level, because as I've said in the answer to my previous question, there is no level here that's more important than the European one, because this is where all the money moves. You have to look at Horizon 2020 program, you have to look at where all the money resides, billions. There is money, you don't even need to go to venture capitalism, you don't need to go to them. The money exists in Europe to do those things. Where does that money go? It goes to the lobbyists representing big companies. They are not interested in working for the citizens, they are just interested in making even more money, mostly by basically milking the state. That's it. And unless you actually are able to point out the structural deficiencies, both in the European project and in the national project, forget about changing anything, because otherwise you'll just be talking to walls. I mean, these people are there, and they will just give you the talk of being opposed to Google or Facebook, because ultimately they have other clients. They have also clients in the publishing industry who don't like Silicon Valley. They have clients in the banking industry. They have clients in the automotive industry. So you'll have this very complicated talk about we need to preserve European technological sovereignty, but all of that remains at the level of blah, blah. It's not, it doesn't go anywhere because it cannot possibly go anywhere because these people are in structural relationship of dependence on Silicon Valley. That's why, you know, you can have in Italy bashing all these firms for not paying taxes and then being surrounded by them as close as possible at all levels of governments because you cannot do without them. Regardless of how many populist talking points bashing their tax evasion would score you.
One last question. There are many around here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Claudio Gosti of the Fabio Chiusi fan club. I have a couple of... Anyway. You say...
il fan club di Morozov.
I'm happy for that. I have just a potential idea on how we can try to compel this kind of changings without relying on the institution. We saw the biggest failure of the European policy with the cookie law, how much was unupdated and outdated on covering the problem of tracking. What if we start to do some kind of civil disobedience against social network? So some strategy on cloning the content in a neutral place or pollute the infrastructure in order to reduce their own possibility to monetize our data or split our identity to be less trackable, or also compel whistleblowers inside of these companies in order to understand which kind of business model exists on our behind. What do you think about this kind of approach?
Well, I mean, look, I think it would make for great art, you know, but the problem with this kind of interventions, you know, they aren't going to leave any dent in what these companies would do. You know, as much as I'm a big admirer of the Situationist International, I don't think that they have created huge dents in the structure of world capitalism through all of the creative things they've done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's very hard to make Google care about you, even if you engage in any structural civic disobedience with them. You can, you know, engage, you can create an extension in your browser that will trick the NSA. I mean, people have done it. The problem is that, again, here, you are talking about a very small segment of society. Basically, you know, a bunch of artists who, most of them live in Berlin and go to Transmediale would do those things. It has zero relevance to the world at large. If you really want to engage in civil disobedience, the institution should be targeting should not be Google, it should be the European Central Bank. I mean, look, this is where the problems reside in Europe. They do not reside at the level of this they're just an extension. They're just an extension of a much deeper malaise. The problem is that that extension will become the core infrastructure of how that malaise will be managed. Right? So, and this is why I'm focusing so much on the tech firms. But to me, it's obvious that they are a consequence, not the cause. Right? And the cause is elsewhere. And if you really want to engage in profound political, economic, structural change, you have to identify your enemies precisely. Because if you don't identify your enemies precisely and you just leave it at this discursive level, oh, this, you know, digital totalitarians in Silicon Valley, you name no enemy. It's very comfortable that way. You know, you can continue kind of scoring these rhetorical points, while it's obvious that the reason why the world works the way it does today has 90% to do with economics and 10% with technology. As disappointing as that might sound to a room interested in technology, I'm sorry to acknowledge that.
We got time for a very last one. There's one here. Oh, okay.
Oh,
sorry.
Just hi, Evgeny. Two questions. The first, in your opinion, is there the risk of a new technological determinism in the analysis of global system? And a curiosity, how is important for your theory and for your approach the contribution of Frankfurt School, Adorno or Keimer? It's my curiosity. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting note to finish on. So I have to go to Perugia to be asked about Adorno. With regards to determinism, I mean, look, I don't want to get into a very theoretical debate about different kinds of determinisms, and you know what people mean by technological determinism differs quite a bit. I think there is a and I often fall into, I might appear to fall into some kind of technological deterministic framework myself, in part because what I'm saying is that once Silicon Valley comes and runs the show, all resistance will be futile. So I am sort of aware of how the trope influences my own thinking, but this is not because I think I'm a technological determinist. It's because partly because I'm an economic and political one, and you know, I do think that who runs and owns what matters. You know, for me, the question of ownership has never really disappeared. And I do think that, you know, who owns a particular system to a certain extent does determine the behavior and the broader social structure that it generates. In that sense, you know, anybody who's a proper Marxist is a determinist. In that sense, I haven't really abandoned any of that determinism. I wouldn't say that I'm a technological determinism, but I see nothing wrong with determinism as such. I mean, we can account for complexity and we can account for a possibility of multiple outcomes. But for me, you know, there is a lot, and this is maybe brings us a little bit closer to the Frankfurt School question. You know, there are several multiple logics on which the world runs, and you better than I know about differentiation and how they all come into being. And you know, and yes, 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, it was possible to argue that the logic of the art market is different from the logic of the newspaper industry, and it's different from the logic of your local public administration, and that itself is different from the logic of economic life. Now, I would be very hard-pressed not to say that all of those logics have become convergent upon just one logic, and that's the logic of the commodity and the logic of the market. Like, it will be very hard to convince me that there is anything other than money that drives modern art today. Like, you go to London and you'll be convinced of that in like a day. And by that, you know, yes, there is a lot of complexity, but there is also a lot of simplification. And that simplification has to do with the fact that virtually every single domain and industry, including media and journalism, which are now, all they're doing are just hunting eyeballs, instead of pursuing investigative stories and actually going after power. For the most part, it's all about hunting the eyeballs and chasing the eyeballs. Why are they chasing the eyeballs? Because this is where the money is. And the profit margins have been squeezed so much that no other logics are allowed. So in that sense, I'm afraid I have to say that, you know, I'm a determinist in that once I see the logic of the market enter, I see other logics leave. And the Frankfurt School, it's a complicated question. Some of them are much closer to my heart, like Benjamin, than others. I wouldn't say that it's of super importance. Some people closer to the Frankfurt School, like Lukács, have had some influence, but it's okay. I mean, and as much as they attack the positivistic foundations of social science, which now, you know, you listen to these guys about big data, they think that big data gives you an objective picture of the world. I mean, this is where you might actually need people like Horkheimer to actually offer a thorough critique of positivism as such, because I think we are undergoing a return of positivism of scale that has not been imagined before, where, you know, we take knowledge at its face value and we think it's objective. We just need to look at data.
Okay, we're definitely out of time. That's a finishing note. That's a finishing note. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And thanks again.
And also far less corrupt, if you look at some of the rhetoric that Uber, for example, makes vis-a-vis the taxi industry, which is not incorrect. And at the same time, they pitch themselves as more or less not just inevitable, but also undisruptible partner of the public, because it is literally impossible to present and come up with any alternative to them as infrastructure, because they're the ones who run the sectors, who own the data, who own the machine learning and data analytics platforms for making sense of that data, which basically means that any project that would like to offer an alternative vision for social emancipation that does not default to just private property, commodification of everything, privatization of everything, is forced to work in that new environment where more or less that infrastructure for organization and that infrastructure even for the administration of everyday life is already in the hands of firms whose primarily interest is profit, even though you do not necessarily see it, because much of what they offer is offered technically at zero cost or at subsidized cost, right? So there is a natural tendency in that sector to be seen as allies of the public, because they make services that previously you had to pay for cheaper. It used to be that the majority of what they did was relatively innocuous. I mean, journalists suffered because clearly a lot of money was taken from them because they could no longer make money from advertising, but it was more or less limited to the media. With the proliferation of the Internet of Things, and the ability to collect huge amounts of data, it became possible to put the same logic of optimization into other domains, from education to health to transportation to whatever you want to name. There is probably a digital platform and a digital intermediary that has stepped in and offered itself as the natural way to organize how that particular industry or social domain is run. Whether it's Uber when it comes to how we use taxis and private transport, whether it's Airbnb when it comes to housing, whether it's any of the number of startups that currently exist in Silicon Valley, there is probably a company that would like to change and transform how every single industry or sector is run and administered. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that clearly there is a transfer of power to the private sector, which is, a landmark characteristic of neoliberalism, that you suddenly have a new type of capitalism emerging that presents itself as ultimately being far more efficient and far more effective than the previous kinds.
Can you take your seats, please? We're about to start. Thanks. Okay, good morning. Welcome to this event. Again, Silicon Valley. I'm Fabio Chiusi. I'm a freelance journalist. And my guest here is Evgeny Morozov. He is author of a couple of, I think, fundamental books to understand the so-called digital, which is going to be problematized today. One book is to Save Everything, Click Here from 2013. The other one is The Net Delusion, 2011. And then we have this one. This is just for the Italian public, actually. It's a collection of essays. It's called Silicon Valley, Signori del Silicio. And we're going to discuss a bit, starting from this book. So I'll go straight to the questions, and I'll go straight to the point. In the book, again, he writes that the thesis is quite simple, and to debate technology today is to endorse, often unwittingly, some of the vilest aspects of the neoliberal ideology. And worse, it doesn't matter what side you're on, for most critiques of Silicon Valley are also happen to be aligned with neoliberalism. So my first question is, what are these aspects of neoliberal ideology that comes into play when talking about Silicon Valley, and what kind of ideology, what you mean also by ideology here?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think we can, or they make them free completely. And I think that ideology actually started with Google, where you had a company enter a domain that previously, which is, a domain of information and communication services, right? Which is about how we find information and how we communicate with each other. If you look at what kind of institutions provided that service before Google's entrance, you would clearly identify at least two of them. One would be the post office, and one would be the library. And both the post office and the library worked on a very different logic. One of them was funded through taxes, and another one was heavily funded through taxes, but was also heavily funded through stamps and other sorts of ways for paying for the delivery of the actual service. Right? From the perspective of the user, if you're just thinking only in terms of cost and price, which to me is the hallmark of neoliberal ideology, it's the reduction of virtually any decision making to the price signal as the only determinant of value, then if you're only thinking in terms of price and cost, of course, this new ecosystem that emerges from Silicon Valley and Google is vastly superior because A, it comes for free, B, it technically, even though that's not correct in reality, does not really require much by way of taxes, and C, it's much more efficient and much more superior. Of course, in the process, you lose a lot of other things. You lose the anonymity that you had in using libraries and post offices. Leave aside the easiest question and about technology in general, and I think we have, broad agreement in this room that technology can be of great assistance to all sorts of emancipatory projects, political, social, and so forth, communal ones. There is nothing inherently solidarity or anti-human in technology
or
as such.
Right.
The problem is that today, if you do want to put technology to a good use for political emancipatory change of any kind, if you're a social movement, if you are a radical new party, if you're a new radical government that would like to challenge any part of the current neoliberal agenda, you're forced to work with the technologies that we have. The technologies that we have right now happen to be run and owned by just a couple of 4 or 5 firms, most of them American ones, who increasingly take over functions that used to be performed by other social, public, non-commercial institutions. So there are 2 elements here. First is the way in which the entrance of those firms into areas of society and domains of society beyond just advertising, which is used to be primarily how they made money. If you look at Google and Facebook,